All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're digging into a text that sets up this really powerful and honestly, for a lot of people, a really challenging contrast between two totally different ideas of justice.
So, the source material we're looking at today really kicks off with this central question. What actually happens when these ancient biblical laws just smash right into our modern legal systems? The answer, at least according to this text, couldn't be more different.
And really, at its heart, the text frames this whole thing as a choice. A really stark choice between two worldviews, right? Each one has its own definition of justice, of what responsibility means, and what restoration looks like. So, we're going to break down exactly how the source material sees this huge divide.
Okay, so first up, let's look at the first system the source examines, and that's the biblical model of justice, which it argues is built entirely around this one core idea, covenant. And everything really hinges on this one big idea. See, according to the source, and it's pulling from Genesis 2:24 here, the physical act of union wasn't just some casual thing. Nope, it was seen as covenantal cement. It literally created a binding, one-flesh bond between a man and a woman.
Okay, so what did that actually look like in practice? Well, the source points to Exodus and Deuteronomy and lays out this pretty clear process. If a man and a virgin were discovered together, the law required him to pay the bride price. And then, unless her father said no, he was bound to her for life. The whole point, as it's presented here, was all about restoration.
And this is a really crucial point the text makes. In this system, the legal and the financial weight fell squarely on the man. It was his job to provide for her, and he could never, ever just cast her away. The focus of the law, as the source sees it, was all about his responsibility to make her future secure, not to shame her. All right, so that's one side of the coin. Now let's flip it over and look at the modern legal system, which the source critiques pretty heavily as being a system built on shame.
Yeah, the text paints a really stark picture of the modern approach. Instead of being bound to support her, a man in a similar situation today, especially when you factor in age of consent laws, is often branded a felon. And he faces these lifelong consequences, mainly by being placed on a public registry.
And this is where the source really puts the two systems head to head. On one side, you've got this system it describes as being built on covenant, restoration, and responsibility. And on the other side, a system it calls out for stigma, punishment, and shame. One that it argues ultimately exiles a person from their own community.
To really drive home just how permanent this is, the author uses this really powerful metaphor. They say the registry isn't just some list you're on. It's a kind of modern exile, a digital cage that you can never, ever escape from. And then the source brings in this quote from the prophet Isaiah, who is calling out the king of Babylon for his cruelty, for refusing to ever free his prisoners. The text takes that same condemnation and applies it directly to the modern registry, arguing it works in a similarly harsh, unrestorative way. So what are the actual bars of this so-called digital cage? Well, the source lists these very real-world consequences, lifelong hurdles to finding a place to live, getting a job, or even just being in public spaces like parks, all while your name and face are paraded online for anyone to see, forever. And all of this leads us right to the core of the conflict that the source material identifies. It's this profound theological standoff, where these two systems of law aren't just different, they're in direct, head-on opposition to each other. So here's the absolute heart of the clash. The argument being made is that the state doesn't just offer another option, it actually outlaws the biblical response. It commands stigma and exile in the very situation where, from this perspective, the Bible commands covenant and restoration. You know, the source frames this whole conflict as just the latest chapter in a long history of believers feeling forced to choose. It brings up that famous declaration from the apostles in the book of Acts, we must obey God rather than men, and applies that same thinking to this very modern legal problem. And man, when you see the commands side by side like this, the opposition just becomes so clear. According to the source's reading, where God's law says restore, the state commands stigma. Where one binds in covenant, the other breaks in exile. And where one is about redemption, the other is about branding someone with shame. So what's the greatest danger in all of this? According to the author, it's pretty simple. It's silence. The real risk is that if people don't understand these distinctions, they might start to mix up these man-made systems of punishment with what they believe is actual divine justice. And that brings us to the end of the text, which isn't really an ending at all. It's more like a direct, really provocative challenge aimed right at the reader.
The source just hammers home its final point with these powerful parallel phrases. On one side, you have a command to marry, provide, never cast away, to take responsibility for life. On the other hand, you have a sentence of prison, registry, perpetual stigma, a punishment for life. One path restores, the text argues, while the other one just destroys.
And so, in the end, the source boils it all down to just two paths, that's it. One is all about covenant and restoration, the other, exile and stigma. In this analysis, there's absolutely no middle ground.
And that's exactly where the source material leaves us. It doesn't hand you an easy answer. Instead, it just leaves you with this direct question, forcing you to think about what justice is really for. Is it about restoration, or is it about exile? Is its foundation covenant, or is it stigma? That's the choice we're left to think about.